So we're covering a couple chapters today, and what we're covering is Paul's first missionary journey. So in Acts, there's these three journeys that Paul goes on, and we call them missionary journeys because he's kind of being a missionary. He's going to these different places that, at least this time, haven't really heard much of the gospel, if at all. And so he's being a missionary to these people. And so we're going to see him and Barnabas and initially John Mark. He'll leave eventually, but these three eventually leave Antioch. That's their home church. And they're going to go to 9 different cities. At least that's what I counted. And so we're kind of seeing a transition in the book of Acts. Up until now, it's been mostly following the work of Peter. There's been other people too, like there was the chapter about Stephen. We saw some things that Philip did, but it's been mostly Peter. Now it's almost exclusively going to be following Paul and the stuff that he's doing. So this is a map of this missionary journey. This is on the last page of your notes, and so you can kind of follow along, I guess. So he starts in Antioch, and he'll go through, and then he'll backtrack, and he'll eventually make his way back to Antioch. So how I've divvied this up is just from location to location. So we'll start with them leaving Antioch and going to Cyprus. Then they'll go to Perga, to Antioch, then to Iconium, to Derbe. And then the last little section is them backtracking to Antioch again. So, first, we see them leave Antioch, and they will eventually go to Cyprus. This is the first part of chapter 13. The beginning of this chapter picks up where chapter 12 leaves off. Chapter 12 ends with Barnabas and Saul returning to Antioch from Jerusalem. You may remember that, hang on, I'm not ready for that. You may remember that they had went to Jerusalem to help with that famine that they were having. They were delivering stuff for the people of Jerusalem at that time. So now they come back, and they've brought John Mark with them. And we see here at the beginning of chapter 13 that the church at Antioch, which is kind of their home base congregation, they had a lot of spiritual men. It mentions in verse 1 that there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers, and then it lists a few of them. And included in that is Barnabas, and included in that also is Saul. And so there's a lot of spiritual people in Antioch at this time. What happens is while they're worshiping, this is in verse 2, Barnabas and Saul are called to be sent out. One of the things to mention is the fact that they're called to this. It's not like they made this decision on their own, but this is something that they were called to do. And who it is that calls them is the Holy Spirit. So in verse 2, it says, while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. And you may remember when Saul becomes a Christian, before that, when the Lord is speaking to Ananias to go and talk to Paul, or to Saul, the Lord said to Ananias that Saul is going to be a light to the Gentiles. And so this is what the work is going to be. This is what they're called to do. And so they're going to go on this missionary journey. And so they're called by the Holy Spirit, and they're sent out to go and do this work. And so it mentions a few cities that they go to. They first go to this place called Seleucia, which if you look at your map, it's just outside of Antioch on the coast there. And then they set sail for Cyprus. Cyprus is an island. It's an entire island with cities in the island. And the city that they arrive at is Salamis. Salamis is a city in Cyprus. And one thing that we see here is, if you remember back in chapter 4, Barnabas is a native of Cyprus. It doesn't say what city he's from, I don't think, but he's a native of this island. So this is where Barnabas is from. So they're actually starting with something that would be a little more familiar, or at least for Barnabas it would have been, starting in Cyprus. And another thing to notice is we see that when they get to Cyprus, there's already Jewish synagogues there. So here on the early part, they're not dealing with pagan people. These are religious people. These are Jewish people, or there were Jewish people on this island. And there's going to be a pattern. We'll talk about it. Paul, everywhere he goes, if there's a Jewish synagogue there, he goes there first. And then he'll deal with Gentiles after that. And that's going to be sort of the pattern that he establishes on this journey. So there's the Jewish people there on this island, and they're kind of just going through the entire island. And they make their way across to another city, and the city is Paphos is where they end up at. And they come across a magician or a sorcerer. And it's funny because this must have been pretty abundant back then, because they came across, or at least Philip did, another magician earlier, and now there's one here. Except this magician is actually called a Jewish false prophet. And what that means is that he would say that he had this message of God, but not only was it not from God, but it also probably contradicted what God would have said. And so he's a false prophet. He's claiming to speak on behalf of God, but he really wasn't. So he's a big phony. And it's kind of interesting. You look at this, and it mentions in verse 6, he's a Jewish false prophet, and his name is Bar Jesus. That's the name that he went by. That would be, I guess, what you could call a stage name kind of a thing. And Bar Jesus literally means son of Jesus. That's like when Jesus tells Peter, he calls him Simon, because that's his legal name, Simon Bar Jonah. That means Simon, son of Jonah, is what that Bar means. So in calling himself Bar Jesus, he's saying that he's a son of Jesus. So he's kind of, it seems like to me, sort of piggybacking on some of the stuff that Jesus did, and he's trying to make a grift out of it. And he was also known as Elymas, which Elymas, I don't know if that would be his real name, or that's a name with a little bit of symbolic meaning. It could be a symbolic kind of thing, but that was another name that he went by also. And one thing we notice here when you read this is he did not want the proconsul, who was kind of the ruler of that part of town. He did not want the proconsul to hear the gospel. And the question is, why would he not want the proconsul to hear the gospel? Well, I think it's obvious. It's because the gospel is the truth. He's someone who spreads lies, and so this is competition for him. And he probably realizes that if the proconsul believes the gospel, he's not going to have much say in anything anymore. And so it says in verse 8, Elymas the magician, that's the meaning of his name, opposed them, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. So he is speaking against Saul and Barnabas, trying to contradict what they're saying so that the proconsul doesn't believe. And what happens, first of all, this is the moment where Saul suddenly becomes Paul. There's not really an explanation as to why his name changes. It's basically the same name, just a different letter at the beginning. It sort of marks a transition, though, because now at this point, Saul had been kind of a background character, but now he's kind of making his way to the front. He's going to be the prominent person now. And the name change kind of is a cool way to show when that takes place. And what happens here is Paul now rebukes Elymas, this false prophet. And he says a few things about him. One thing is he calls him the son of the devil. That's in verse 10. He calls him the son of the devil instead of being the son of Jesus. What he's doing is he's setting the record straight. You're not a son of Jesus. You are a son instead of the devil. He also will go on to list some of the fruit from this false prophet. And I have this reference from Matthew 7 and verse 16 because Jesus talked about false prophets there. And he said, you'll be able to tell them by their fruit, by the results of the things that they're doing. And so Paul points out a few of these things. And so he says, you son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, full of all deceit and villainy, will you not stop making crooked the straight paths of the Lord? So these are the things that he's doing. And these are things that would be observable for anybody, at least anybody who has any sense, or anyone who is looking for the truth. And so these are the things that this prophet is doing, this false prophet. You're a son of the devil, you're an enemy of all righteousness, you're full of all deceit and villainy, and you're making crooked the straight paths of the Lord. And so he rebukes him here, and then he will go on to say in verse 11, are we ready? Okay. He'll go on to say that he's going to get blinded. Verse 11, he says, and now behold, the hand of the Lord is upon you, and you will be blind and unable to see the sun for a time. So he says, now you're going to go blind. And this is kind of an interesting thing because one thing, that's kind of what happened to Saul. He was blinded when he was on the road to Damascus. But another layer of this is blindness can be sort of a symbolic thing. It's showcasing the spiritual blindness that this false prophet had, meaning he's not receptive to spiritual truth. Instead, he's a peddler of spiritual falsehoods. He's a false prophet. So Paul says he's going to be blind, and that's what happens immediately. It says this is still in verse 11, immediately, meaning like as soon as that happened, immediately mist and darkness fell upon him, and he went about seeking people to lead him by the hand. So immediately he is made blind, just like Paul said would happen. And so this is something that gives Paul credibility. He has said something's going to happen, and immediately when he said it, it happens. And after seeing this, the proconsul believed. And so this is the very thing that Elymas didn't want to happen. Well, now because of his own shortcomings, it has happened. And so we see something that Paul does here. There's this sign that happens, and I'm not sure if Paul is the one who orchestrates it or if the Lord does it and Paul just knows that he's going to do it. Either way, this guy gets blinded, and that's a sign. It gives authority to what Paul is saying. It gives him credibility. And so now, after that, the proconsul believes. It says in verse 12, then the proconsul believed when he saw what had occurred, for he was astonished at the teaching of the Lord. So it's not just the sign, but it's also the teaching. But the two go hand in hand, and that leads to a good result. Any questions? Now they're going to go to Perga, and they'll eventually go to another Antioch. Antioch of Pisidia is the other one. So this is a pretty big section because there's a lot that happens here. So Paul and the rest, they set sail for Perga, and they eventually end up in Antioch in Pisidia. So this is the main place where this section happens, is in Antioch of Pisidia. The other Antioch, where they had come from initially, was in Syria. This is a city with the same name, but it's in Pisidia instead of Syria. One thing to notice here, this is going to come up later, I think in chapter 16 it'll come up, is John, it says in verse 13, John left them and returned to Jerusalem. This is going to be a point of contention later on between Paul and Barnabas, which will lead to them actually separating and going on their own journeys. We'll talk more about that when we get there. But John Mark goes back home. He doesn't even go back to Antioch. He goes back to Jerusalem, where he was from. So John Mark leaves, and so now it's just Paul and Barnabas and whoever else might have been with him. And now, like what they have done and what they're going to do, they go to the Jewish synagogue there, and they go on the Sabbath. Because on the Sabbath they had these readings and things that happened, these words of encouragement. And that's what they ask for Paul to do, is to give a word of encouragement. This is in verse 15. So they're there in the synagogue, and they're reading, and it says, after reading from the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent a message to them saying, "Brothers, if you have any word of encouragement for the people, say it." And I almost wonder if they knew Paul as Pharisee, but they maybe didn't know Paul as Christian. Otherwise, I don't know why they'd ask him to speak. It's kind of ironic, because they're not going to like what he says, but they still ask him to speak initially. And so now Paul gives this message in the synagogue, and this is the first lesson that we see Paul giving. What he does initially is he gives a history of Israel up until the point of King David. So he starts in verse 16, and he talks about how the God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers, and he talks about Egypt, the time of the Exodus, and talks about them taking the land. Then he talks about how they asked for a king. He talks about Saul, King Saul. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. And then he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, "I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart who will do all my will." So he brings it up to David. And so David is who is going to be sort of the groundwork for this lesson that he's going to give. Because what he goes on to say is he refers to Jesus as this promised son of David. This is something that the Jewish people would have been very familiar with. There's the promise that God gives to David in 2 Samuel 7 of a son who's going to sit on the throne forever. They've been waiting for this son of David person to come and to be king. They were hoping it would be an earthly kingdom. As it turns out, it's a spiritual kingdom. But, point withstanding, this is still the son of David, and this is Jesus. He also mentions that this message of salvation is, which talking about Jesus, or he mentions that this is the message of salvation, the message of Jesus, the gospel. And he talks about how the Jewish rulers, which keep in mind, there's some Jewish rulers here that he's talking to, rulers of the synagogue. The Jewish rulers in Jerusalem, they rejected the message of salvation about the Son of David. They rejected it by killing Jesus. And so you may notice this is sort of following some of the general patterns of Peter's preaching. He'll talk about how, Jesus is the Christ, you killed him, but God raised him. Paul's going to follow that similar pattern. And in fact, that's the next thing he says. The Jewish leaders rejected him by killing him, but God raised him from the dead, and it was seen by other people. Paul can't say that we saw it, because he wasn't there. He had an encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, but he didn't see the resurrected Christ, per se. But other people did see it, and that's reliable eyewitness testimony. So God raised him from the dead. People saw him. They were able to touch him and feel him and talk to him. He was obviously raised from the dead. And he then goes on to tell them that God's promises are fulfilled in Jesus. These are people who, remember, they would have been very familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. And they're fully aware of the promises that God has made that were needing to be fulfilled. And he points out that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of these. So one of the things that he says, "We bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers, this he has fulfilled to us, their children, by raising Jesus." And then he references a few scriptures in this too. He references Psalm 2. he also references a few other psalms here. So God's promises are fulfilled in Jesus. And then finally, he warns them to not fulfill what the scriptures say of scoffers. Those are people who speak against somebody. And he quotes Habakkuk 1 and verse 5. So he says, "Beware, lest what is said in the prophets should come about." And then he quotes this from Habakkuk where he says, "Look, you scoffers, be astounded and perish, for I'm doing a work in your days, a work that you will not believe, even if one tells it to you." So he quotes this passage from Habakkuk and applies it to their situation. In other words, don't be a scoffer like what Habakkuk talked about. So that's the message that Paul gives. And we see that his message is initially met with some positivity from the people. It mentions in verse 42, the people begged that these things might be told them the next Sabbath. So they want him to come back the next Sabbath and share these things again. And it even mentions, it says in verse 43, after the meeting of the synagogue broke up, many Jews and devout converts to Judaism followed Paul and Barnabas, who as they spoke with them urged them to continue in the grace of God. So there's a lot of devout Jews that are buying what they're selling. And Paul evidently was pretty convincing in his message because it's a rational message. He has evidence to support his message. And so there's devout Jews, people who are sincere in their faith, who are following Paul and Barnabas and who are also encouraging them, urging them to continue in this, to not give up in this. So they want him to preach again on the next Sabbath. And he goes to do that again, except this time he's not going to have as easy of an opportunity. Before, the Jewish leaders said, hey, if you have a word of encouragement, give it to us. This time they're not going to be so welcoming. So it mentions in verse 45 of this chapter, when the Jews saw that the crowds, when they saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy. That kind of goes back to the time of Jesus. That's sort of like what happened with them. Or at least one of the things. There's more to it than that. And so they became jealous of the size of the crowd. And what happens is they began to contradict and revile Paul. And what that means is Paul would say something, they'd contradict it. They'd say, well, that's not true. This is what it is. And so they're speaking against what Paul is speaking, and they're also reviling Paul. So they're going against Paul's message, and they're going against Paul himself, the person. They're reviling him. They're insulting him. And so this reaction leads to Paul and Barnabas turning to the Gentiles. This is a really key moment here. Paul, this is in verse 46, Paul and Barnabas spoke out boldly, saying, it was necessary that the word of God be spoken first to you, since you thrust it aside and judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life. Behold, we are turning to the Gentiles. And so this is a key moment, because now it's going to shift, and this is what we've been seeing leading up to this. Gentiles are going to have the same chance as the Jews. That hasn't always been the case, but now they're going to have the same chance. And now, because the Jews have said that they are not worthy of it, this is them saying this of themselves. They don't want it. And so because they don't want it, they're going to turn to the Gentiles, because the Gentiles are going to be more eager to hear it, because they don't really have anything at all. And after saying that of course makes them angry, and the Jews drive them out. And so they get driven out of Antioch, and they end up going to Iconium. So now they're going to go from Iconium to Derbe, and this will be as far as they go before they backtrack. Any comments? Questions? All right. So now we get into chapter 14, and they've been driven out of Antioch, and they go to Iconium. And once again, it's kind of funny, because they've just said, because you've rejected the message, we're going to turn to the Gentiles. But they still go to the Jewish synagogue first. And this is an important thing, because even though their mission is now to the Gentiles, it's not exclusively to the Gentiles. If there's Jews there, they're going to preach to them. They're not going to exclude them from the opportunity. But the Jews are going to usually be hostile to it. And so now the focus is on the Gentiles, but it's still giving an opportunity to the Jewish people. And so what will happen, not just with the rest of this journey, but with the other journeys that Paul makes, if he goes somewhere and they have a Jewish synagogue, he'll go there first. I think every time. At least typically. I'd have to look and see if there's any exceptions to that. But he typically will go to the Jewish synagogue first. And I think the reason for that is because the Jewish people have more of a groundwork that's been laid. They're already religious. They're already familiar with the Old Testament. And so they would have a stronger base to start with. But because of their hardened hearts and their stiff necks, because of their stubbornness, they usually aren't going to be very receptive to it, which is why they're going to also go to the Gentiles. And so we see in chapter 14 and verse 1, at Iconium they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. And so now he's speaking, and a great number of people have believed, but despite that, we see in verse 2, but the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. And so there's these unbelieving Jews in Iconium that are stirring up trouble. And this is going to be a theme throughout a lot of the book of Acts with Paul's journey, is much, not all, but much, maybe even most of the persecution that Paul gets is from the Jews. They're going to come and they're going to stir up trouble, and that's what they're doing here. And so it mentions here that the Jews poisoned the minds of the Gentiles. Usually they wouldn't have anything to do with Gentiles. But when it comes to putting down Christianity, they're all over it. And so they poisoned the mind of the Gentiles against Paul and the others. And we see in verse 4, the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and some sided with the apostles, or with the Christians. And so there's a split here. Are you going to side with the Jews, or are you going to side with the Christians? Well, the opposition tries to orchestrate a way to have them stoned. They want to kill them, which is ironic, and this is going to come up big later as well, because obviously it's against the Jewish law to just kill people for no reason, or because you don't like them. But they're going to try to have them stoned, which that leads to the Christians there fleeing to Lystra and Derbe. That's a region, two cities that are pretty close together, often paired together, kind of like Tyre and Sidon, or places like that. So they go out of Iconium, they go to Lystra, and they probably wanted to, lay low, because they were driven out of Antioch. Now they've had to run away from Iconium. But they get to Lystra, and now the spotlight gets on them, and there's a bunch of attention that's put on them. And so what initially happens is Paul heals a crippled man. There's a man who can't use his feet. He was crippled from birth, it says. He's never walked before. Paul heals him. He's able to walk. It says he sprang up and began walking. That's in verse 10. That healing, because that's one of the things that happens with healings, is it authenticates the message and the messenger. It gives you credibility. Well, in this case, it gives them a little too much credibility. The healing leads to the people at Lystra worshiping Paul and Barnabas as if they were gods. And so it mentions, you could tell these are more pagan-minded people. So it says, the crowd saw what Paul had done. They lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, their own language, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes. These are Greek gods. because he was the chief speaker. And so they are referring to these men as gods. They give them godly names, Zeus and Hermes, and they come and they're going to make sacrifices for them. And obviously they don't want that, and so they speak against it. And so Paul tries to pivot, and instead of talking about them as gods and referring to these pagan gods, he tries to draw their attention to the living God. And so he says in verse 15, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things, these things that have no meaning, to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them." So he tries to pivot their attention to the living God. So he testifies about these things, and it doesn't really work. In verse 18, it says, "Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifices to them." So the people there are worshiping them as if they're gods. Well, now there's all this attention that's been put on them. Probably has made a big ruckus. And what happens now is some of the Jews from the previous cities, from Antioch and from Iconium, they follow them into Lystra. And so now there's these Jews that have driven them out of these other cities, and they followed them into Lystra. And like they had done before, they stir up the crowds in an attempt to have Paul stoned. And so it's kind of interesting how quickly this turns. And this maybe speaks a little bit to the people at Lystra, because they instantly go from worshiping these men and making sacrifices to them, all of a sudden they're convinced that these men need to be stoned. And so it says in verse 19, "The Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing he's dead." So they are attempting to have him stoned, and this time they execute their plan. Paul is stoned, and they just assume that he's dead. They leave him there to die. Maybe they're assuming that he will die. And they leave him for dead outside of the city. This is, of course, a wrongful execution. There's no trial or anything. This is just mob mentality here. Paul, of course, doesn't die by some miraculous sort of thing. He gets up. This is in verse 20. "When the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe." So Paul, he's obviously pretty injured. He's obviously pretty banged up. But he gets up, he goes into the city, and then they move on to Derbe. And Derbe is the last place that they go before they backtrack. So now they're going to eventually make their way back. Any comments on any of that?
Do you think that there's still people who worship Paul and Barnabas?
I don't know. Perhaps. I don't know. I know there's people who still worship those gods, more or less, Zeus and Hermes and all that. Even though it's pretty understandable now that those were made up. That's why when you learn about those in school, it's called Greek mythology, because they're myths. But I wouldn't put it past some people to do that. All right, so now they're going to backtrack to Antioch. And so they leave Lystra, because that's obviously a bad experience. He just got stoned there. And they go to Derbe. And it says in verse 21, "When he had preached the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch." So he's made disciples in Derbe, and now they're starting to make their way back. And what's funny is, I would imagine, I don't know, they could have perhaps sought an alternate route, because I would imagine they wouldn't want to go through those cities again, but that's what they do. They go right back through the towns where they had been persecuted. I wonder what the people thought when they saw Paul walking back through there, because they've stoned him. They probably assumed that he was going to die, and yet here he is walking back through. I wonder what they thought about that. This shows some guts by the Christians. They're going back through the cities that they probably didn't want to go back through. I wouldn't want to go back through there, especially Lystra after getting stoned. And what they're doing now, so they've went through this initial trip, they've made disciples, now they're going back through and they are strengthening and encouraging the disciples that they've just made. So it mentions in verse 22 that they were strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. So these disciples have probably seen what has happened. They've seen the opposition that Paul and the others have had. And now they're encouraging them, because after seeing that persecution, some of them may have had some second thoughts. Well, gosh, if they're going to stone me, maybe this isn't what I need to be doing. Well, they go back through and they encourage them to keep with it, to continue in the faith, even saying that it's through these tribulations that we enter the kingdom. And of course, Jesus, he is the example of that, going to the cross. And one thing that is mentioned in verse 23, this is really interesting. When they had appointed elders for them in every church, with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. So they're not going to leave until they put elders in. Elders is the model that God has for local congregations to have a sort of authority figure. It's not like in Catholicism the Pope is the ultimate authority. That's not how it is in the Bible. How it is each local congregation has their own authoritative person. And they're not authoritative in the sense that everything they say is right and so on and so forth, which would be like the Pope. The Catholic doctrine is that he's infallible, which obviously a person can't be infallible. But what they're doing instead is they're putting elders in. That's the local authority for the congregations, and that's the model that God has made. And they don't leave until they put these elders in, because they're leaving. They're going back to Antioch. And so they need some leaders there. And the leadership model that God has ordained is through elders. So they put these elders in, and eventually they pass through Pisidia and Pamphylia and Perga and Attalia, and from there they sailed to Antioch. So eventually they sail back to Antioch where they started from. And this is showing us that Antioch is their home congregation. Antioch is home base. Kind of like us today, Mount Morris is our home base. We can visit other places, and if we're traveling, we might do that. Or if there's something like a gospel meeting or a seminar thing, we might go visit those. But this is our home base. This is our home congregation. They had a home congregation, and it's Antioch. And once they come back, it says, when they arrived, they gathered the church together, and they declared all that God had done with them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. Notice it's not what they did, but it's what God had done. This is really important. They're not taking the credit for this. It can be easy when we're trying to, because we're all called to this, to make disciples. It can be easy to say, oh, well, I led this guy to Christ. I led this person to be saved. It's God who's doing the saving. God did these things through these men. And the same thing applies to us today too. And what God had done for them is he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles, and of course many disciples were made. Quickly, here's a few key takeaways that I have important for us to think about in relation to the first missionary journey. So now the shift has been made from the work of Peter, more or less, to Paul. And the shift is also a shift from primarily Jewish converts to now primarily Gentile converts. There's still Jewish converts that are going to happen, but the focus is now on Gentiles. And Paul is the one who's orchestrating that. And so the first part has followed Peter, now it's following Paul. Another thing we're going to see is that Paul's efforts are often met with hostility, and persecution. And this is going to happen just about everywhere that Paul goes. And it really speaks to Paul that he sort of wears this as a badge of honor. He doesn't let that hinder him. He keeps on keeping on. And that speaks a lot to the faith that Paul had. And then, just quickly, one last thing is the key verse of the book of Acts is Acts 1:8, when Jesus says, "You'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth." And these words are slowly but surely coming true. So it started in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 2. It spread through Judea and Samaria, that immediate sort of region there. And now, through Paul and through others, the gospel is spreading to the ends of the earth. He's now going to different continents, different countries, so on and so forth. And now it's including Gentiles. And so you compare this to also what Jesus said in the Great Commission, when he said, "Go and make disciples of every nation." Now they're living out the Great Commission also. It's every nation. It's not just the nation of Israel, but it's every nation. And so now that is coming into fruition. Acts 15 next week, kind of an important chapter. So we'll just focus on that a little bit. Any comments or questions?